Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for our second of the Earth2Earth seminars. Please visit our website earth2earthseminar.com for information about the series or to nominate a speaker. Earth2Earth is organised by a governing board with representation from UK universities, Nature Geoscience and the British Geological Survey, and any UK institution that wishes to have a representative should contact us by email. We're holding seminars every 2 weeks at this time and day. They're open to everyone via both Zoom webinar and a live stream on YouTube. This will be recorded and with speaker permission will be available to view on the YouTube channel with closed captioning. Please see our website for calendar links and further information. We also ask that during seminars you follow our code of conduct, which you can find on the Earth2Earth website. If you have questions during the talk today, please use the Q&A channel at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll use the comment function on YouTube. These can be posted at any time during the seminar, and you can upvote questions that you like to make sure we have a chance to ask them. We should have around 10 minutes at the end today for me to relay your questions to the speakers. Now I'm going to hand over to Thomas Richardson from Nature Geoscience to introduce today's speaker.
Hello everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Kuheli Dutt from Columbia University, where she is currently the Assistant Director of Academic Affairs and Diversity at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. Kuheli has a PhD in Public Policy from Northeastern University, and her research explores diversity issues within the STEM fields, focusing on implicit biases based on gender and race. Kuheli has published a number of highly influential articles tackling these complex and challenging issues, including 2 pieces with us at Nature Geoscience. The most recent of these, published at the start of this year, focused on race and racism in the geosciences, in which she highlighted the lack of diversity in the field and stressed the need for a concerted shift in mindsets. It is a testament to the importance and quality of Kuheli's work that her comment has been the most highly read piece published in Nature Geoscience this year by a substantial margin. I very much look forward to hearing Kuheli speak today on such important issues for the geoscience community. Thank you very much for being with us today, Kuheli, and I will now hand over to you for the seminar.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Is it okay if I share my screen now? Good morning, everyone. Oh, well, good afternoon. It's morning here in New York. Thank you for having me. Today, I'll be talking about addressing systemic racism in the geosciences. The geosciences, as you know, are among the least diverse STEM fields. And what I notice is they're very similar scenarios for the US and the UK. In the US, the term we use is underrepresented minorities. And that usually includes Black, Hispanic, Latinx, Native Indigenous, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian, and it excludes Asians. In the UK, you use Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic, or BAME. And whether it's the US or the UK, these minority groups account for a very small percentage of PhDs in the geosciences, and an even smaller percentage of professorships and senior leadership positions. Now, the geosciences, I mean, the leadership is, it's a predominantly white discipline, and the leadership is predominantly straight, white, cisgender male. In the US, less than 4% of underrepresented minorities, less than 4% of the faculty at the top 100 institutions are underrepresented minorities. And in the UK, it says it's less than 10%. And I suspect this number is so much larger only because it includes Asians, because when you look at Black faculty in the UK, it's less than 1% Black professorships in higher ed. I'm not going to go into any details of these charts. I just want to show how similar the US and the UK are. So this is the US, where among the physical sciences, geosciences are one of the least diverse, specifically underrepresented minorities. And this is in the geosciences in the UK, again, showing a different version, but the same message, that this is one of the least diverse fields. I also want to thank the authors of this paper, Natasha, Dawi, and others, if any of you are listening. Thank you so much, both personally and professionally. Personally, this helped me to compare the US and UK scenarios. So it was very helpful for me, as I was putting together this talk, but also, in the larger context of geoscience, I think this paper here is the UK equivalent of what in the US is the Bernard-Cooper-Dock paper, which is a very important paper. So thank you for doing this. In the STEM fields, now, whether it's the US or the UK, you have minority students tending to leave these fields at higher rates than the white students. In the UK, the term you use is Russell Group for these, very prestigious institutions, Oxbridge, Imperial College, and so on. In the US, we have the Ivy League, but it's the same in the sense that minority groups are less likely to get accepted, or they form a smaller percentage of these students. In the US, there was a study that found that LGBTQ students ended up leaving STEM fields at higher rates than cisgender heterosexual students. And another study found that women of color in particular experienced the highest levels of harassment. And the reason I'm mentioning all of these points together is that when anyone who's a minority, whether it's a person of color, whether it's female, whether it's someone LGBTQ, when they all end up leaving at higher rates than the dominant groups, then one does need to acknowledge or accept the exclusionary culture of many of these STEM fields, and geoscience is definitely in there. Academia in general, as you know, has a very rigid hierarchical structure with very opaque decision-making processes. And like any other power structure, you have elements where the dominant groups, whether it's white or male or cisgender, straight, controlling the outcomes for the minority groups. The US, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the National Academies of Science report on harassment. Academia has this dubious distinction of being second only to the military when it comes to harassment. And while the focus of today's talk is about systemic racism, it's important to keep in mind that systemic racism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of a larger system that's prevalent in society of implicit bias and stereotype threats. And it is that combined system that creates systemic racism. And we're all a part of that system. So even if we don't participate in hate crimes across minority groups or anything, we're part of the larger system where implicit biases and stereotype threats are very normal and very common. Very few incidents actually rise to the top. So for example, recently we had the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, most recently the shooting of Jacob Blake. These are the overt incidents that rise to the top. This is what you'd call the tip of the iceberg. And so that's the top 10% right there that you can see. And this was, from a US perspective, the N-word and KKK and lynching and hate crimes and swastikas, these form the 10%. But the 90% at the bottom, that 90% is systemic racism. That is where systemic racism lives. That is where it thrives. And the key thing to note is that we are all a part of the system, often, maybe unconsciously. So if we want to address systemic racism, we need to address the 90%, which is what allows the 10% overt instances to happen. I also want to clarify at the outset the distinction between racism and prejudice. Now, racism, contrary to what a lot of people think, it's not a character defect. It's a system of advantage that is based on race. And you could replace that with any other word. So for example, I'm originally from India, and you could just replace the word race with caste and you have the same thing. It's a system of advantage. Individual prejudice is something that anyone can have. People of all groups can in fact have individual prejudices. And research has in fact documented that. So it's not just majority groups that hold prejudices. The main difference is at the root of systemic racism is a power differential. in that a certain group, that is the dominant group, is in a position to control outcomes for or inflict harm on a minority group when the minority group doesn't have the power to do the same. So the power differential is the key difference between racism in the general sense of the word and prejudice. The other thing to keep in mind is that, like I said, people of all races can hold this. So this is not something that only a particular majority group holds. So for example, I live in Manhattan, in Harlem, which is a very diverse neighborhood. And I have this African-American friend who, a woman who is married to a white American man. And they lived in my neighborhood. And it just so happened that we used to go to the same local neighborhood grocery store. And what we discovered later on one day when we were chatting is that whenever he went to the store, he was never the white man. He was never asked to show his ID when using a credit card. But every time my friend went, the Black woman, or whenever I went and still go, I'm always asked, or she was always asked to show her ID when using a credit card. But the key thing here is that the people asking for IDs, the people doing this, were themselves Black and brown people. So this is just the point to say that prejudice can happen across all groups, and we all receive very similar conditioning, and we're all socially conditioned in many similar ways. Academia in particular has very deeply entrenched biases against Black people. So I'm just going to give a very quick snapshot of that over here. Now, I could go on and on, but you get the idea. Systemic bias, it's important to keep in mind, systemic racism is actually rooted in implicit bias. So for example, I'm using gender over here, but research, whichever field you look at, including the geosciences, show that women tend to receive less glowing letters of recommendation than men. There was a study done by some researchers at Yale a few years ago that found that job applications for a lab manager position where they had identical CVs. It's just that half of them were named John and the other half were named Jennifer, and that the CVs that were named John were ranked higher, by both male and female faculty to identical female applicants. Very similar studies have been done with race. There was a study that sent out thousands of fictitious CVs, and they were identical, except some of them were named, with Western sounding names like Greg and Emily, white sounding names, and others with ethnic names like Lakeisha and Jamal. And what they found is that the white sounding names, the CVs for the white sounding names, got 50% higher callbacks for interviews than the identical CVs with ethnic names. In the US, we have NIH, the National Institutes of Health. They did a study that revealed that on average, Black scientists received less grant funding than similarly qualified white scientists from similar or comparable institutions. In the UK, you have the National Environmental Research Council, and only 6% of the studentships were awarded to minority groups. Now, most of you have probably heard these terms, but I'll still go over it very quickly for the sake of completeness. White privilege, which you've probably all been hearing a lot about now in recent months, is a systemic advantage that results from being white, or where whiteness is viewed as a default. Now, one has to keep in mind that you can have white privilege, but at the same time face other challenges, and oppression. So just because you have one type of privilege doesn't mean that you can't have a challenge or oppression or some sort of hardship in another identity. White fragility, this is a term that was made very popular, famous by Robin DiAngelo, is in a nutshell the discomfort that a white person might feel when information about racial injustice is presented to them, especially if it's in a way that makes them feel that they're perhaps being implicated or perceived as racist. White comfort, again, the other side of white fragility, refers to this feeling of an entitlement to an absence of discomfort when one is talking about race. And of course, one can write books about all of these. There are books about these, but I just have one bullet point each for the sake of time. Colorblind racism is a very well-intentioned form of racism. It's where you'd say things like, I don't see color, we're all human. We shouldn't look at race or gender, we should only look at merit. And these are well-intentioned, but what it does is that it denies racial reality that, say white people have a very different racial experience in society than say a person of color. And when you look at a sentence like, we shouldn't look at race or gender, we should only look at merit, even though at the surface it's well-intentioned, it's problematic for two reasons. One, it suggests that there's a trade-off between diversity and excellence. And so if you look at someone's race or gender, then somehow you're compromising on merit. And equally importantly, it makes this erroneous assumption that merit is some sort of an objective concept, when in fact it is a highly subjective concept which exists in the eye of the beholder. Whitesplaining, similar to mansplaining, is when you explain something about racism to a person of color, which is usually perceived as condescending, like, I'm sure there's another explanation, maybe you're just mistaken, or race had nothing to do with it. And while these might be on the surface well-intentioned, it ends up minimizing or dismissing racism. Microaggressions, again, is something that many of you are probably aware of, what it is, the definition. These can be intentional or unintentional. So an unintentional one, which is well-intentioned actually, is when you express surprise when a person of color does well at something and you say, oh, you're such a credit to your race. And while on the surface that's a compliment, the implication is somehow that that group is not good at this thing. Unconsciously checking your wallet when a person of color passes by, or following them around the store. Within the academic community, I've heard a lot of these from students, from scientists, from junior staff. A Black person in a STEM department is often asked, are you lost? Or they're asked, do you have an appointment? Or a person of color being asked to show ID when white people, including the white people immediately surrounding them at that moment, aren't. Or a biracial person being told, nah, you're not really Black. Now, racial stereotypes are usually a negative perception of someone based on stereotypes. And in the US, here are some racial stereotypes. And like all stereotypes, these are generalizations of, of smaller groups. And another example of white privilege is the absence of stereotyping, because it is typically smaller groups, minority groups, that get stereotyped as opposed to majority groups. Let's take a look at this example. Now, as you know, in the US, we do have this, this problem. So this is the number of mass shootings in the US over the last 37 years. And the number of mass shooters who are white male is more than the number of mass shooters of all other races combined. And yet people of color are more likely to be stereotyped as being violent or associated with crime than a white person. And when you see a white man walking down the street, your first thought isn't going to be, oh, that might be a mass shooter. So this is an example of how an absence of stereotyping benefits a larger dominant group. Affinity bias. Now this, in my personal opinion, is perhaps one of the most powerful biases that exist, because it's a part of our own natural instinct. And what this means is we have a tendency to prefer people just like ourselves, people that we relate to. And this is not a bad thing. This is part of our natural survival instinct. And so we're sort of pre-programmed to prefer people who we view to be people as our own kind. A study found that babies as young as 6 months to a year old showed a preference for people of their own race. And this isn't necessarily, affinity bias is not limited to race. It could be professional affiliation, say be someone from an Ivy League or a Russell Group university associating with another person from a similar university as opposed to a community college. or any informal networks, or religion, or socioeconomic status. It could be anything. It could even be a person or a group that you identify with and that you feel an affinity towards. It could be, a sports group. It could be, think Manchester United versus Liverpool. So these are all rooted in, a sense of affinity that we have towards a certain person or a group. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you look at the leadership in academia and in geoscience, it's not a coincidence that it is mostly white, mostly male, mostly straight, because it's a combination of affinity bias and systemic racism. Because in the other examples that I gave, you might, like a group or like a person, but you don't necessarily have the power to enforce that preference. Whereas when you're in a position of power in the geosciences, when you're, say, in the leadership position or in academia, you actually have the power to act on that preference, to act on that affinity bias and hire people who look like you. So that's why it's very important to be aware of the fact that we all have affinity bias. This is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term. She's a very famous legal scholar. She's a professor at Columbia and at UCLA. She coined the term intersectionality, which talks about how someone with multiple marginalized identities is the most disadvantaged within society. So for example, when you look at, say, women as a group, the feminist movement, it mostly benefited white women rather than women of color. Or the LGBTQ movement benefited people, white people who identify as gay or lesbian, as opposed to, say, people of color. And there's a very different lived reality between, say, a cisgender, gender-conforming, white gay man versus a Black transgender woman. In the US, at least, the highest rate of fatal hate crimes, of fatal violence, happens to Black transgender women. This is actually a video that I've been using for the last couple of years, long before I knew that one day I'd be talking to a British audience. Usually I only share the first 2 minutes because the rest of it is about Britain, but today I think I'll share the whole thing. Let me see if I can do this. Hang on. I'm just gonna have to stop share for a moment and pull it up on my screen. I apologize for that. My apologies, I'm just gonna pull up the video. Can you see that? Okay, I hope so.
When somebody tells me that they don't see race, I say, that's fine. You can choose not to see the sky, but it exists. I'm told I was 4 years old when I turned to my mum and I said, well, when am I going to turn white? I was consuming and engaging with media and culture around me, a lot of cartoons, a lot of kids' TV, comics, etc., etc. And well, all the good people were white, and I considered myself to be a good person. I realized at that early age that to be white was to be human. I was attempting to discuss race in white-dominated circles and really getting nowhere. I wrote a blog post. I titled it, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Let's say we were having a broad conversation about inequality. As soon as I tried to raise the topic of race, there was an almost immediate clamp down, shut down, denial from my conversation partner. They tried to find ways to convince me that absolutely no, race had nothing to do with it, that actually I had a chip on my shoulder, and that, why was I trying to make everything about race? I'd actually decided to have a conversation with a person who can now confidently say probably is a white anti-racist, a white critical anti-racist. And I spoke to her about her journey and I said, well, what's led to you being somebody who is so aware of how race shapes inequality? She said that a lot of her defensiveness initially when it came to these conversations about race was a fear of being wrong. A fear of, she said a lot of it was to do with her ego, a fear of being implicated in existing inequalities, a fear that she actually wasn't doing enough. I know that I have not spoken out in the past for fear of losing a job or losing a friend or losing a space in a house share because when you discuss race in the conversation, you become the troublemaker, you become the problem. I dedicated a whole chapter in the book to discussing intersectionality, and it's really from the perspective of my doomed encounters with white British feminism. And they were really doomed because I was surrounded by very nice, white, middle-class women who just didn't want to hear about race. And I was told I'm splitting the movement, I'm being divisive, etc., etc., etc. And that was really a galling time for me because I don't really have the option of separating these two issues. In Britain, power is still very white here. Black and minority ethnic people are about 14% of the population, but that definitely is not reflected in the corridors of power, in who shapes culture, who shapes politics, who shapes the arts. No one's asking the gatekeepers to examine their own prejudices and ask, well, why aren't you recruiting people who are not like you and not from your background? I heard a great quote, and I can't remember who said it, but the person said, you know, you can't ask me why I haven't been invited to the party. You have to ask the host. My name's Rennie Edo-Lodge, and this is my brief but spectacular take on talking to white people about race.
So now we just, going back to all the key terms and concepts that we just looked at, we looked at a whole bunch of them. And the thing to keep in mind is that all of these happen around us simultaneously. And together, they present major obstacles to the advancement of people of color or any minority group, wherever you have a dominant versus a minority group. And the combined effect, as you can imagine, is enormous. And I thought this pictorial did a great job of summing it up. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of anti-Blackness, a lot of racism is actually rooted in anti-darkness. There was a study that found that someone with stereotypical Black features was actually given a longer criminal sentence than someone with lighter skin. And this isn't just, say, in the prison system. This is more like, a global phenomenon. This is China, Nigeria, the Middle East, India, Korea. I mean, this is a larger global phenomenon where actually lighter skin is preferred and darker skin is not. Some examples of racism. This is Brent Staples. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and he was a graduate student in Chicago in the 1970s. And what he noticed is that when he walked down the streets, people avoided him and they felt threatened by him. They crossed the street or ladies clutched their purses, and he would smile at them, he would wish them, and he realized it was because of the negative perception of Black men, the stereotype of Black men at the time, that people were afraid of him. But it didn't help. People were still afraid when they saw him. He started then whistling tunes from classical music as he walked down the street, and he noticed an immediate difference, and suddenly those people weren't afraid of him anymore. So he portrayed himself as someone cultured and then removed himself from the negative stereotype of Black men. Now let's look a little bit deeper at what's really going on here. You have three pieces. One is a microaggression where you don't want to be around a person of color, where the white people, didn't want to be around this Black person. Two is a stereotype threat. They didn't want to be around him because they assumed that as a Black man, he was threatening or dangerous or some sort of negative perception. And then the notion of white comfort. That is, he had to present himself. He changed, his behavior or the way he presented himself in a way that made white people comfortable. This is a US university, and this was their idea of a diversity campaign. And of course, it was in the news for all the wrong reasons. Just look at the left side where they have the white people and how they're described. I am a future corporate financer. I am a future doctor. Look at the right side where they have the Black people and look at how they've been described. And so what you see over here is, the systemic racism, which is, more subtle here because, one would say, well, if they've put people of color here, that was the idea of their diversity campaign. But, when you're describing a white person, you're talking about their potential. You're talking about them in glowing terms. You're talking about what you see them becoming. And when you're describing the Black person, you're just describing them based on the color of their skin and nothing more than that. The next slide, does contain a reference to violence, so consider this a trigger warning. This is the president of George Washington University, and this was earlier this year. He had been asked by some students who were protesting a certain center on campus, that if the majority of students wanted to shut that center down, would he shut it down or not? To which he responded, what if the majority of students agree to shoot all of the Black people here? Do I say, well, the majority voted? No. And hopefully all of you see immediately why this is incredibly offensive. But initially he defended his comments by saying, well, I said I didn't want to shoot Black people. In other words, he thought he wasn't saying anything wrong. And the issue here is that the first thought that came out of from the top of his head, or out of his mouth, when he wanted to give an example of why a majority vote isn't necessarily always the best vote, in his opinion, is the example he gave of shooting Black people. Now, in STEM geoscience, in geosciences in general, we have this exclusionary culture, as I mentioned earlier, which is predominantly white. And what this means specific to racism is that people in power typically have a very limited understanding of race and racism and how it works. And that there was a study by the Pew Center in the US that found that white people were much less likely to acknowledge that racial inequity exists and that something needs to be done about it compared to people of color. And it was a very big difference. I think it was around 50% white people versus almost 90% Black people. In other words, when you have a very different lived reality, you don't necessarily attribute the same importance to something. Similarly, there is this disconnect that I've seen between people of color and white people in terms of how they tend to view race. And very often, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, not just limited to anti-racism, but whether it's LGBTQ awareness or advancement of women, it often tends to be done mostly by minority groups. And in the system, and when we're talking specifically about systemic racism, the white lens becomes the default norm. This is an example I like to give, to point this out. There was this US college president survey last year. And when they were asked what they thought about US race relations on college campuses in general, only 25% of them felt that race relations on US college campuses in general were good or excellent. But when asked about their own campus, 81% of them said that race relations on their own campuses were good or excellent. And this is a symbol of a larger problem, where you have, where you tend to shift the problem. So either, you don't accept that there is a problem, or even when you do, you believe that it happens elsewhere, that it doesn't happen here, happens in other places, or other people might be a racist, but I'm not. And if that were truly the case, if it were, as easy as just shifting the blame on someone else, then there probably wouldn't have been any need for a talk like today's. But, and especially now that people are talking about systemic racism, it's just that, we need to delve deeper into this to fully address it, rather than just absolve ourselves from blame and say, well, I didn't have anything to do with it, or it happens elsewhere, but not here. Now, in the geosciences in particular, there are three broad problems that happen simultaneously. One is the pipeline, very low numbers of minorities getting their PhDs in the geosciences, an absence, a very conspicuous absence of role models, and a culture, a lack where, where minority groups don't necessarily feel included or like they belong. And if we truly want to make progress, all these three things need to be addressed simultaneously. You can't do one and not do the others and then expect positive change to happen. Now these can be addressed on two different levels. One is the individual level, and the other is the institutional or departmental level. Now, at the individual level, we need to all accept that we're not free from bias. And this might sound like I'm stating the obvious, but I've noticed that scientists in particular tend to be very resistant to the idea that they might be biased. And they usually counter it with, we're scientists, we're trained to be objective. And yes, as a scientist, I have no doubt that you're objective and you do your science objectively. But as a human being, you're just as susceptible to bias as anybody else. And so you need to separate your identity as a scientist from your identity as a human being when you're talking about being subjective or being biased. In a similar way, one needs to separate one's identity as a white person from one's identity as a good person, because conflating the two is only going to lead to conflict or some sort of confrontation or just defensiveness, and it's not going to be a productive. It's not going to lead to any productive outcome, because, as I said, racism is not a character defect, it is a system of advantage. Another thing that I ask people to do at an individual level is, what have you actually done to combat racism? And I ask this because I've been Lamont's diversity officer for more than 10 years now, and I've almost never met someone who didn't identify as a supporter of diversity and inclusion. And so, it's important to ask yourself, I view myself as being supportive, but what have I really done? And one example I like to give here is from this book called Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla Silva, where he gives this example of a survey where, white people were asked whether they would be okay with having a family member bring home a Black person for dinner. And about 80% of the white respondents said, of course, like they would have no problem with, they'd be totally okay with if a family member brought home a Black person for dinner. But then when he dug deeper, he found that less than 10% of white people actually had close Black friends. And so there is a disconnect between often how we view ourselves versus the actions that we take. And we need to better align these two in order to create change. This one is easy. When you're invited to speak on a panel, ask how many people of color are on it and what efforts were made to invite them. Now, it's possible some fields in the geosciences are so narrow that you might not have very many people of color, or very few, but it's important to keep this on the radar and to keep asking this question. Another example I like to give is, another thing I like to tell people is to look deeper on an individual level. Look below the surface. Don't just look at the what, look at the why. And one example I give is COVID and the Black community. So it's, as you know, it's probably similar in the UK as it was in the US, where Black communities, Black and brown communities got hit harder by the pandemic than others did. And for the Black community, the medical science, if you will, says that Black community is associated with higher levels of hypertension and diabetes and heart disease and so on and so forth. And from a medical sense, I'm not doubting or questioning any of that. But the larger issue is it really that surprising that a community that has known oppression for generations is going to have elevated levels of markers for stress? That's the question we need to be asking. The other thing I encourage people to do is to do your homework. It's not the duty of people of color to educate white people on the subject of racism. And sometimes these conversations can be difficult. I mean, I've been giving a lot of implicit bias presentations, racial bias presentations. And one time, this was within the Columbia community, I was giving the same presentation to a few different audiences. And the same presentation for, in one particular instance, a Black man said that the presentation was too gentle because it lets white people off the hook. In another audience, same presentation, a white man said it made him feel uncomfortable and marginalized. And it was the same presentation. And so that's why these conversations are highly subjective, highly nuanced, very complex. And so these are not easy conversations to have. But if you really want to do something about it, one has to at least start with that. On an individual level, try to collaborate with scientists of color. This is a very helpful graphic that I found. When you move from a fear zone to a learning zone to a growth zone, and in the fear zone, you avoid hard questions and you just want to be comfortable. In the learning zone, you step out of your comfort zone and you learn a little bit more about the subject. And in the growth zone, you embrace your discomfort, you speak out, you educate people on being anti-racist. At the institutional level, one needs to invest very heavily in pipeline programs, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. It's also important to invite speakers of color to conferences, panels, seminars, and to appoint them to leadership roles. Another very key thing is to have transparency in search and hiring processes, because that serves as a very effective check on things like affinity bias or systemic racism or stereotype threat. The more transparent it is and the more people know what your thought process was for hiring someone, the easier it is to check implicit biases and address systemic racism. One needs to acknowledge DEI work, especially since, as we know, that it's mostly minority groups that do it. One suggestion is to revise your promotion criteria to include including DEI work, because currently, in most places, criteria for promotion is usually based on things like publications and grant funding and courses taught and student evaluations and so on. If possible, compensate people for DEI work, but even if it's not possible, find a way to formally acknowledge it. And if you are a person of color, a woman of color, or any person of color who's been asked by your department to help out with diversity work or anti-racism efforts, if you don't want to do it, say so. If you want to do it, that's great. But even if you do go ahead and do it, make sure you tell your leadership, you tell your department, sure, I'm happy to do this, but which white people will be working with me on this? That's really important, because if we want to have everyone take ownership, it can't just be people of color who keep doing this work. Develop an action plan, do a salary equity study. And again, this is something, most people are not going to like the results that they see. So for example, if you just say, what's the average salary of white people in your institution versus the average salary of people of color, or what's the average salary of men versus women, you're probably going to find significant differences. And I would encourage you to not just explain it away as, oh, well, these people just do more important work, but to reflect on it and acknowledge the role that unequal access of opportunity, of resources, of education play in allowing that system. Revise your syllabus and curriculum. If all your speakers or all the authors and books in articles you include or happen to be white authors, why is that? And is there a way to include others? Now, in particular, there have been studies done on minority students specific to the geosciences, and the geosciences are not necessarily as accessible as other programs. And the pipeline problem actually begins at the high school level. It happens well before college. A lot of people don't not only know what the geosciences are, but they don't even know if it's a viable career choice, as opposed to, say, becoming an engineer or a doctor. What I found is that for many people, what inspired them to go into the geosciences were things like camping and recreational camping and hiking and recreational activities with family and friends. And a lot of times, inner city kids, minority students, underprivileged students don't necessarily have access to these things the same way that people from different socioeconomic statuses might. And even for those who enter the field of the geosciences, entering as undergraduate students, they experience, as we've seen from earlier studies, isolation, exclusion, not belonging. And yes, we do want minority students to enter these fields, but here's a thought that I'd like to share with all of you. How do we expect 17, 18-year-olds to commit themselves to a discipline when A, they don't know much about the discipline, they don't see role models in it, they don't see people, they don't feel represented, and they don't feel included? So put yourself in their shoes. Would you do something like that? And that's why, unless we change the culture, unless we have role models, we're not going to see larger numbers of people entering these fields, because even if they do, as the earlier study showed, they would just leave at higher rates than white students. Now, there are various factors, and I noticed that I'm very short on time. I have just a few minutes left, I think. So I'm not going to go over these in detail, but there have been studies done on what factors influence whether minority students go into the geosciences. And I would encourage all of you all your departments, A, to create a pipeline program, but also to use this info when developing your pipeline program, because in order to be effective, it needs to be customized. And so students need to feel like they belong. Sometimes they don't necessarily have the math preparation for the geosciences for no fault of theirs, just because they didn't have access to certain education and resources. Need to see geoscience faculty as role models, self-confidence, that's an obvious one. And also positive experiences relating to the geosciences. So whether it was, having a professor that they liked very much, or a really nice experience when they went out in the field, that can shape whether they want to join this or not. Similarly, at least in the US, and I imagine it's similar in the UK, a lot of minority students are the first in their families going to college. And so they might not have a lot of information of the entire college application process. So any pipeline program should help guide them through that process as well. And of course, income and career prospects. Now at Lamont, we have one particular URM pipeline program called the SSRP, which is the Secondary School Field Research Program. And this is a summer internship program where we bring these kids to campus. Well, this year it was done remotely because of COVID, but usually they physically spend time on the Lamont campus over the summer, where they do field work. It's predominantly underrepresented minority students, mostly girls. They do field work nearby places. So they go to either the Hudson River or the Piermont Marsh to collect water and soil samples. They bring these back to the lab and they're taught how to analyze them. They're put into research groups with mentors. And then at the end of the summer, they do a presentation, a research presentation to the entire Lamont community on their summer project. And they're treated like early career scientists. This is a very successful program. Most of our students have gone on to college. About 50% have declared STEM majors. And this helps towards creating a pool of minority geoscientists. And if all geoscience institutions committed to doing this, in as little as one generation, we will see a significant change or significant strides towards racial diversity. This is another picture of the students in their lab coats analyzing water samples from the Hudson River. The inset picture that you can see of the senior white man, that's one of our senior scientists, senior research scientist, Bob Newton. He directs this program and over the years has personally built this up. And the reason I put his picture there is that it's really important for senior white men to take ownership of this problem rather than view it as someone else's problem. And he goes out of his way to create a personal rapport with these students. And they are not only inspired by him, but they all got together and nominated him for this thing called the Mentoring Award that we have. I should be able to end in a minute or so in case someone's keeping time. We have this thing called the Lamont Mentoring Award. Originally, it was very limited in scope. Just traditional faculty, traditional PIs were the ones who received it. And we broadened the scope to broaden the type of mentoring being recognized. Internship programs, lab mentoring, opening it up to who can be nominated and who can nominate others and submit letters. And over time, the first 10 years of the program, only about 14% were female. And in the last 10 years, 50% have been female. And at Lamont, like most geoscience institutions, it is a very, very white campus. And we don't have nearly as much diversity as we should, specifically with underrepresented minorities. We do have a lot of Asian representation and a few Hispanic and Latinx representation. So to conclude, to address systemic racism, we need to address these three things simultaneously: the pipeline issue, the role model issue, and the culture of geoscience. You can't have diversity without inclusion. You can't have inclusion unless people feel like they belong. And people are not going to feel like they belong unless you acknowledge their identity. DEI issues need to always be on the radar. You can't just attend one talk or read one book or have one conversation and think that it's done. In the same way that you can't just have one publication or one grant and think that your science is done. Just like you keep working on your science all the time, this is something that needs to be constantly given attention. And in order for the most meaningful and sustained action, you do need institutional leadership to take ownership of the problem, because they're the ones who have the power to allocate resources and to set the tone and to shape the policies for the institution. And with that, I'll end. Here are just some books if you're interested in reading. If you haven't yet taken the implicit association test, I would encourage all of you to take it. Thank you. Let me just stop the screen share.
Thank you very much for that really fantastic talk. Thank you for kind of laying out lots of things that people can do. Often people want to get involved but don't really know where to start. So that was really fantastic. I've got a few questions in the Q&A that I'm going to ask, if that's okay. So the first question is from, it says, with increasing activity taking place in universities around anti-racism, how should we go about measuring the success of our initiatives and our interventions?
I mean, it's important to distinguish between, what can come across as tokenism. Like suddenly you've seen this rush where everyone is putting out statements about Black Lives Matter and so on. And of course that's important, but for that to be truly meaningful and not be viewed as tokenism, it needs to be followed up by very meaningful action. And some of the examples I gave, in my slides, like change your syllabus, invite people of color, appoint them to leadership roles. All these things require institutional commitment. They require institutional resources. And I think only when an institution, or only when you do something like that, can you truly say that you have engaged in, anti-racism activities and addressing systemic racism.
The next question from an early career researcher who's increasingly disillusioned. A lot of senior scientists don't seem to see DEI work as important. How do we convince them to take notice and support initiatives?
I actually get asked this particular question at every single presentation I have given. And I know, and I think that's part of why I emphasize so much on having the leadership get involved, because ultimately it's the leadership that sets the tone. Because when you have a department that is, 90 to 95% made up of, at the senior levels, made up of, senior white men, if they don't take it seriously, if someone that they respect or someone they look up to doesn't take it seriously, there's no way they're going to take it seriously either. And what you'll have is a situation where students, where postdocs, where people of color or people from marginalized groups at lower ranks will continue to do this work, but almost like running to stand still, because there isn't going to be any real change. That real change can only happen when the leadership sets the example for senior faculty and scientists to follow.
There is another question I just wanted to follow on from that, was something that I wanted to bring up myself. So you mentioned the Natasha Dowie preprint early on. So I was part of the group that pulled that data together. And
that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you.
I'm glad it was useful. But the main kind of reason why we did it is because with things like PhD student recruitment, many of us have been kind of bringing up that there's this problem, there's this kind of, there are these kind of structural issues for months, if not years or longer. And quite frequently the answer is, well, I don't see there's a problem. Where's the data? And we shouldn't need to point to this data, but without the data, people deny it exists. And it's really challenging to, I guess, get people to engage if they don't have any skin in the game. But it's very
doing that. Thank you for doing that. And I think it's very true, because in the US, the Bernard-Cooper-Dutt paper, I think only once that got published, people suddenly started sitting up and taking notice. And I think scientists, like once they see the data, and especially if it's published in in a publication like or a high-level venue, suddenly they're going to give it a lot more importance than if it's just anecdotally told to them in terms of experiences of people within their own departments.
So there's another question, a practical question. Do you have advice on how to fundraise to support pipeline initiatives like the SSRP you mentioned, both within an institution and without, in particular now that funding for departments is tighter than ever?
Again, this is an issue of leadership, because even embedded in a question like that is the assumption that things that are considered normal should go on as usual, and a pipeline program is considered other. So unless there's a pot of money for it, we're not going to be able to do it. When in fact, institutional leaders can find a way to reallocate resources in a way that makes sense for that department or institution to say, we're going to allocate, we're going to remove money from this area and channel it into another area. And again, that has to happen at the leadership level.
A question from Sudeshna says, he says, Asians seem to be better represented in geosciences in the US. Not sure if it's true for the UK, but is there anything to learn from that?
In general, I mean, from what I saw, it looks, they're sort of comparable in the US and the UK, but of course I wouldn't know the details or, go into too much detail. But I think one of the larger issues is when I said that systemic racism is actually embedded in a larger system that is prevalent, of implicit biases that are prevalent in society. And Asians tend to be, they tend to, unlike Black scientists, Asians tend to benefit from a positive stereotype of Asians in STEM. And so they're not necessarily viewed, their ability as a scientist or an academic might not necessarily be questioned the same way that a Black scientist's potential or capability might be questioned. But again, I don't know the exact figure, so it's a little difficult for me to, to give a very specific answer.
Another question, what are your thoughts on instituting EDI policies and fieldwork?
Again, that's another thing, again, for institutional leadership. And in fact, I don't know recently if you saw this movie that's just been released. It was in the US so far, but it's called Picture a Scientist, which is about harassment in, that covers harassment in the field. And, in general, studies have shown that, minority groups, whether it's women or people of color, they tend to have, a recent article I think just came out talking about, LGBTQ experience in fieldwork. They're all uniformly negative. And again, this is something strictly enforcing an institutional code of conduct and also enforcing taking action against people who are perceived or, who are, known to be violators or who create not inclusive environments. Again, this is something that only a department chair or leadership can do. And again, this is something that would only happen if there is motivation and willingness to do it. Because the National Academy's report that showed academia is second only to the military in terms of harassment and how completely widespread harassment is, what it found is that even when these instances were brought to the attention of the leadership, there was often very little motivation on the part of the leadership to actually take action. And often these people ended up getting told that, oh, this person is so senior and so powerful. Isn't it just easier for you to go away? So again, the leadership sets the tone on that.
Do you think that positive discrimination could be a good way to increase minority representation in academia?
So, I mean, I'm uncomfortable with the term positive discrimination because it's sort of, it has a certain connotation. And let me just put it this way. Look at the demographics of most STEM departments. Look at the demographics of most geoscience departments. It's predominantly, at the senior levels especially, it's predominantly white. And so, which means that department chairs, department hiring committees are continuously over and over again over the last several decades and on constantly only hired white people, right? But they didn't necessarily put a number on it or a quota on it or any description on it. They just went ahead and hired white people. So now when you are talking about making it more inclusive and hiring people of color, I would encourage you to view it as part of that larger process rather than saying we need X number of people of color, and this is a form of reverse discrimination or positive discrimination, or whatever you want to call it. View it as broadening the system to include better talent and more diverse talent, rather than a trade-off between white person versus a person of color.
So people of color outside of the white world face multiple levels of racism, e.g. publishing papers in high impact journals, getting international fellowships. But while talking about racism, most of the articles are US and Europe centric. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, like I said, it's an issue of different lived realities that when when we personally don't experience something, we're not likely to give it the sort of attention or importance that someone who experiences would give it. And if we're in a position of power to act on that preference or that bias, it means we end up not doing anything about it. Now, for a moment, if we just not look at race, let's look at the issue of disability. How many of us who consider ourselves able-bodied, how many of us spend time worrying about what it must be like for a person with a disability to go through life, to access buildings, to have any of those things? Because it doesn't affect us personally, because we are not weighed down by it, because we have never had a bad experience with it. We don't necessarily think about it or give it that much importance as, say, a person with a disability would. And it's very similar. So this is not about being good or bad, or white versus black, male versus female. This is when someone hasn't known a certain type of oppression, it's very easy to dismiss it. And that's why it's important to put these into the spotlight, to publish as many papers as you can about it, because apparently that's the only way it gets through to scientists, and to keep these issues on the radar, so that those who are truly allies, and I believe that more of the people that I've met than not are in fact allies, that they have concrete action steps, that they have concrete plans, they have concrete suggestions that they can act on to improve the system.
I'm conscious that it's the end of the hour now, and some people might need to leave. Are you happy to keep answering questions? Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay, there's a couple more if that's all right, but let me know if you need to kind of head off. So how do we convince funding agencies to mandate policies to increase diversity in STEM? Currently, too much trust is placed on higher education institutions, which creates a lot of barriers.
Yeah, I mean, I do think funding agencies do need to create some sort of mandate, or even if they can't use the word mandate for legal reasons, at least in the US, something that strongly encourages it, that makes it clear that you're more likely to get funding than not if you show a diverse group, or if you show how this is going to promote anti-racism. Some of the pitfalls of it, and just yesterday I was having a conversation with some colleagues about it, is that even for those who want to say, we're going to hire X number of people of color or target a certain percentage, they might run into legal issues. And so I think it's, rather than mandating it or putting a quota or using a requirement, use language that makes it very clear that you're more likely than not to get funding if it promotes diversity. Sorry.
With increasing nationalist sentiments across the US and the UK, international students, racial and ethnic minorities especially, get minoritized in societies that don't seem to be very welcoming. What advice can you give to students who encounter these issues, and does the academic community have a role to play?
Yes, absolutely, the academic community has a role to play. I mean, the rise of this nationalism all over, I'd say. I mean, I don't think it's just US and UK, I think it's other countries as well. And for example, in the US, and I imagine it was true in the UK, people of Asian ethnicity were targeted because of the pandemic, and they were told, go back to your country, or go back, especially those from East Asian ethnicities. And I imagine something similar happened there. And I think universities can definitely play a role in making the students feel safe and protected. I mean, giving them resources, saying that, finding ways to send them messages to say, we're here for you in whatever way that is appropriate or normal at your institution.
I've got 3 more questions and then we'll wrap up, but I really appreciate you taking your time to answer them. How do we move from people virtue signaling and endless tweeting to tangible activity?
Good question. I mean, personally, I'm not on social media myself, so I'm not even aware of what goes on a lot of the time. But I think in terms of, I think this is a very similar question to one that was asked earlier, that, tokenism versus doing actual work. And, so my response would be the same, that, it's all very well. It's important to verbally acknowledge these things, to issue statements of support and so on. But it's even more important to follow those up with concrete action. And so It could be, a group of students or a group of junior faculty approaching the leadership of your department and, requesting a meeting or a conversation and saying, here are some ideas we have, which are the ones that you're willing to do, or something like that. Start the conversation with your leadership in your department.
Over what timescale should we expect or aim to affect measurable positive change for diversity in geoscience?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, if you looked at the Bernard-Kupadok paper, in the last 40 years, there's been absolutely no change. I would hope that now, given that suddenly everyone is paying attention to it in a way that they weren't earlier, a decade or two, hopefully within a decade, we should begin to see, real action in terms of being able to measure that action, maybe a couple of decades. But again, that's just off the top of my head. I have no way of knowing how accurate that might be. So I guess that's just a guess.
And a final question, which sort of follows on from that in some ways. How do we better engage further back along the pipeline? So at undergrad level, is intervention here while needed too late? And what mechanisms should be used in terms of access to role models and outdoor spaces?
I would suggest, and again, this is based on the US scenario, which is probably similar to the UK, is if possible, try at the high school level or the freshman first year undergraduate level, because that's where you're going to have, I'm sorry, I don't know why. Because that's where you're going to have a lot of people who are still making up their minds about what they want to do, which field they want to go into. Because if they've already decided on a certain field when they're already in graduate school, it might be too late. So trying to get them when they still haven't made up their minds yet and don't yet know what the geosciences are, but are open to the possibility of exploring it, I think that would be the most useful time.
Okay, thank you very much for taking your time. Sorry to the couple of people who have unanswered questions, but I think we've taken up enough of your time. We're very, very grateful for you for coming along today and for answering